thank you for being here, and of course to those who joined us via Zoom. We'll go ahead and get started with our next panel. So we're going to have three speakers. This is the importance of being sorry, forced displacement and transitional justice to and from Armenians. We have Armen Ghazaryan, who is here in person. Armen Ghazaryan is the head of Migration Service of the Ministry of Territorial Administration and Infrastructure for the Republic of Armenia. He is adjunct professor at the College of Humanities and Social Sciences of the American University of Armenia. Prior to the public service, he was a researcher whose main areas of interest include migration studies, European studies, European migration policies. His PhD thesis is on the issue of migration and security in Armenia. He studied public policy and public administration at Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University. Armen Ghazaryan was a fellow at the University of Freiburg, Switzerland, concentrating his research on migration and security nexus. You'll next hear from Mr. Vicken Cheterian. He is a professor, Webster University, Geneva, Switzerland. Dr. Vicken Cheterian is a lecturer in history and international relations at the University of Geneva, at the Webster University of Geneva. He's a practitioner and an author who specializes in violent conflicts. He has done field work in most of post-Soviet and Middle East and North African countries. As a practitioner, he was involved in peace-building projects in the Middle East, the Caucasus, and Central Asia. His academic research has included civil wars, transition, nationalism, sectarianism, jihadism, and genocide. He has published in many leading academic journals, including Survival, British Journal of Middle Eastern Studies, Journal of Historical Sociology, just to name a few. His current research involves the evolution of sectarianism in the modern Middle East. You will also hear from Ruben, Carranza, Director, Reparative Justice Program, International Center for Transitional Justice, ICTJ. Mr. Carranza is a senior associate at the International Center for Transitional Justice and is the director of ICTJ's Restorative Justice Program. He has worked with various state institutions, civil society organizations, and survivors of human rights violations in various post-dictatorship and post-conflict countries in the global south, including in Africa, the Middle East, and North America, Asia, and Latin America. I apologize, North Africa. He has also worked on transitional justice in Europe and in North America. He has been consulted by the International Criminal Court and by the Khmer Rouge Tribunal in war crimes and crimes against humanity litigation before those courts. Through the ICTJ, he has given technical assistance to the Truth and Dignity Commission of Tunisia, the Kenya Truth, Justice, and Reconciliation Commission, and the Commission of Inquiry on Enforced Disappearances of the Nepal. In the United States, he is currently helping the Drug Policy Alliance design a Truth Commission process that will examine the impact of the decades-long U.S. government war on drugs. Before I give the floor to Mr. Ghazaryan, please note you have pieces of paper and pen in front of you, so if you have any questions, write them down, pass them down to me. We will have a designated 30 minutes for just questions and answers. Thank you. Mr. Ghazaryan, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. And thanks. I want to thank the organizers for inviting me. It's a bit weird to be a panel like this, but I hope I can make it do. So, I'll just concentrate on a couple of theoretical points, and then I'll give you a bit of practical, a bit of our practice with recent displacement after the Second Karabakh War. And I would rather pose questions than answer them, and I'll throw them to the floor, and maybe we can discuss through questions and answers and come to conclusions. So, one theoretical point about forced displacement is that it is usually produced by fragile states. strong states with strong statehood and with institutions that are capable to deal with mass movements of people usually do not produce mass displacement. And if you look currently on the world map and try to identify where are the places where we have most forced displacement, you would see that usually we are dealing with fragile states. Currently Afghanistan, Syria, Somalia, and many other countries in Africa. So this is just one point I want to mention. Secondly, we have very new theoretical challenges in international law as well when it comes to migration and the idea of sovereignty. I'll just give you a brief example from very far from us. There are islands disappearing currently in the Oceania or Oceania, I don't know how you pronounce it. And government of Australia has conducted a rescue operation. It has rescued the population of an entire island and moved them inland into Australia. Prior to being relocated into Australia, those people were a state. They had their own sovereignty. So the question and the challenge in front of the experts of international law is whether those people continue to have their sovereignty on the territory of Australia. And I think the experts and practitioners in the area of international law are failing miserably in their attempts to answer to this question, because none has been produced so far, and the reality is already on the ground for quite some time. So let's keep in mind this context of fragility of a state and these challenges to the state's sovereignty in terms of forced displacement, and come to our realities, what we have on the ground. So I've just written down some basic facts from my line of work, and I'll just pose them and let's discuss. So as a result of war and aggression, in 2020 we have had more than 91,000 people displaced from Nagorno-Karabakh proper and the surrounding Nagorno-Karabakh Oblast, let's say, and the surrounding territories, Nagorno-Karabakh Republic. 88% of those people were women and children. 88%. We have, as a migration service, we have been involved, actually we conducted the registration process of the displaced population, which was quite a challenge as we did not have institutional capabilities in place to do so. And we organized a registration system and then put it on electronic carriers, let's say, in a matter of one night. And then we opened access for all the state institutions to know what is going on with the population in terms of, to have disaggregated data to understand what type of assistance is needed in what part of the country. So this was one part of it. Second fact, out of those 91,000 people, currently around 20,000 are still on the territory of the Republic of Armenia. Those people mainly include the population of the region of Hadrut proper and the region of Hadrut. Smaller amount is the population of the city of Shushi and the territories that are currently under the control of Azerbaijan. So that's the rest of that population. Issues I want to discuss with you and pose to you as lawyers or people interested in the law is the legal status of these people. What is the legal status of these people? This question is something which I'm being asked quite frequently. My answer is the following. Those people are the citizens of Republic of Artsakh. This is at least how they identify themselves. Can we say that in legal understanding, those people are refugees? No, we cannot. Why? The Geneva Convention on the Status of Refugees of 1951 says that if the population which enjoys most of the rights that are being enjoyed by the citizens of the country that they are hosted in, if the displaced people have those rights, the convention does not cover them, because there is no fear of refoulement, meaning the return to the territory of risk. And they enjoy most of the rights, as the people of Artsakh do in Armenia. So the convention does not cover them legally. But does this in any manner diminish their social situation as people who are in a situation basically the same as refugees? No, it doesn't. That's why UNHCR mandate has grown since the mid of the 20th century, from covering only people legally being perceived as refugees to people that are displaced. You see, the term is not legal, the term displaced, but it's more descriptive. So it covers more people than just those who have the legal status of refugees. So this is basically what has happened. But I would like to discuss with you, if you would prefer that, whether we have done right by them, whether the Republic of Armenia has done right by them, not saying clearly what is their legal status. So just keep this question in mind, and maybe we will discuss it later. I think that's it. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. I believe we were experiencing a technical difficulty. I want to make sure before we invite our next speaker, the issue has been resolved with IT. Good to go? All right, sounds good. Thank you. So we'll go ahead and invite our next speaker, Mr. Vicken Cheterian, who will be presenting via Zoom. If we can go ahead and connect. Are we unable to connect with Mr. Cheterian? Oh, yes, we can. Good afternoon. Welcome. Yes, we can hear you.
So, thank you for inviting me to this event. I understand that the basic preoccupation of this conference is a legal perspective. I'm not a legal person. My field is history and international relations. So I will bring some elements that looks at ideology and history to understand the culture of of conflict that has emerged between Armenia and Azerbaijan. The basic argument that opposes Armenia to Azerbaijan is, on the one side, on the Azerbaijani side, the issue of territorial integrity, and on the Armenian side, the issue of right of self-determination. Now, I think there is a need to take those two principles and to analyze to what degree the conflict sides have been consistent in their arguments. And I think there's a lot to be said on the Armenian side, how Armenian authorities, the state, the foreign ministry, the diplomacy, has been inconsistent since the 1990s up to the war, 2020, to understand the confusion Armenia has since the war and since the defeat. But I will not go into this in the 20 minutes I have. I will look at the Azerbaijani arguments about territorial integrity, and especially I will focus on the post-war Azerbaijani stand on this issue. So what is the basic Azerbaijani argument? Azerbaijan says that this conflict has been a conflict on territory, and the war in 2020 was trying to reinstall Azerbaijani authority over territories it had lost in the early 1990s. To the argument of right to self-determination, Azerbaijan has developed a secondary argument saying that Azerbaijan is a multicultural state, and therefore Armenian demands can be addressed within this culture and multicultural approach that Azerbaijan has. Now I will look at several points to show that Azerbaijani argument about territorial integrity and multiculturalism can be opposed with certain facts that contradict Azerbaijani arguments. One such fact is a tweet that Azerbaijani President Ilham Aliyev did during the war, more precisely on the 3rd of October 2020, so this is the height of the war, where he says, I restate the historical name of Madariz. As of 3 October 2020, it is called Sugovushan. And then he adds, Karabakh is Azerbaijan. So here we see that the idea of multiculturalism, the idea of Armenians having rights within Azerbaijan, within multicultural Azerbaijan, is contradicted with these policies. Armenian place names, when they come under Azerbaijani control, their identity is denied and their names are changed to Turkic Azerbaijani names. The second example I will bring is in the post-war period, just immediately after the war, on December 10, 2020, Azerbaijan organized the victory parade in Baku. In this victory parade, we had two personalities standing on the platform with the military parading in the streets of Baku, the capital of Azerbaijan. The two leaders were the Azerbaijani President Ilham Aliyev and Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan. Azerbaijani President made the first speech in which he reminded us of genocide. Not the Armenian genocide, but the Khojali genocide, quote unquote. And then he talked about Karabakh, I'm quoting, Karabakh is our ancient historic land, unquote. So here we see that the argument of legal territorial integrity is not that much important as the importance of historical rights. And then he added to this, not only Karabakh is ancient Azerbaijani land, but also, I quote, Zangazur, Goycha, and Yerevan districts are our historic lands. So here we see that on the one hand, Azerbaijan puts forward legalistic arguments, but on the other hand, in this very important symbolic moment, Azerbaijan makes irredentist arguments, calling not only Karabakh, but also Armenia, current Armenia, as historical Azerbaijani lands. What is important is the presence of Erdogan in this very important symbolic moment, and what Erdogan also said during this event. I will quote, "Today the soul of Nuri Pasha, Enver Pasha, brave soldiers of the Caucasian Islamic Army will rejoice." So Erdogan, in this very important moment, when Azerbaijan is celebrating victory in the Second Karabakh War, not only Turkey is present, but the Turkish president is reminding us of events of 1918, when the Ottoman army conquered Baku, and in this event, it is followed by the massacre of the Armenian population of Baku. Moreover, Erdogan is reminding us not only of Nuri Pasha, who is the younger brother of Enver Pasha, but also of Enver Pasha, one of the architects of the Armenian genocide. So this opens a very difficult page in the Armenian-Azerbaijani conflict, which is the long shadow of the 1915 genocide, not only genocide, but also the denial of the Armenian genocide and the recycling of the discourse of the genocide and its denial by Azerbaijan. So Azerbaijan has developed a historical vision in which not only the 1915 genocide does not exist, it's a lie, quote unquote, but also Azerbaijan developed its own discourse about genocide, where Khojali, this massacre that happened in 1992, is elevated to the level of genocide in which Armenians are not victims, but perpetrators of genocide, and Azerbaijanis become victims of Armenian perpetrators. Now, this discourse is much more complicated when we see the post-war Azerbaijani discourse, and especially the infamous victory park that you all heard about. In this victory park, we don't see the Azeris as victims, but Azeris as victorious side who have victimized Armenians. Armenian soldiers are tortured there, are degraded, and are presented as subhumans. Now, part of this, very racist elements have been taken out, but other elements are still present and celebrated in Baku. This discourse of denialism continues, especially with the cultural heritage of Armenians. There has been a lot said about Armenian cultural heritage, and especially Armenian churches and monasteries in Shushi, but also in other territories now under Azerbaijani control. So this denial of Armenian identity and cultural heritage, calling them by very curious names of Caucasian Albanian churches and monasteries, is very strange for any serious historian who has done a minimum of research on Caucasian history, Armenian history, Azerbaijani history, and knows how complicated Caucasian Albanian history is, and how closely associated Caucasian Albanian history, culture, and to church is with Armenian history and culture and Armenian church. So this Azerbaijani propaganda is nothing else than state propaganda and denialism of Armenian identity. So the fourth element I want to bring forward here is this discourse of Azerbaijani multiculturalism and the complete absence of any Azerbaijani official discourse about Armenians in Hadrut, in Shushi, and in other territories occupied by Azerbaijan after the 2020 war, and the complete denial of their rights. So if Azerbaijan is a multicultural state, if Azerbaijan respects the individual rights of ethnic Armenians, then why doesn't Azerbaijan take concrete steps to address the fears of these people and invite them to return to their lands in Hadrut district and in Shushi district, where they lived before the war? Now, I want to very quickly conclude by saying two things. There can be two types of rights. There can be individual rights, right? Ethnic Armenians having rights in Azerbaijan, or if we go out of the region of the Caucasus, we can think about rights of citizens in France, right? Or rights of citizens in Switzerland. These are very different approaches in Switzerland where I live. So from my perspective, the Swiss state recognizes two types of rights, individual rights and collective rights. In Switzerland, we have a very bottom-up system where linguistic, religious, and territorial rights of communes and cantons are respected, and the cultural and linguistic rights of different linguistic communities of Switzerland is respected. In France, this is different. France recognizes citizens to be equal. So France doesn't give any specific rights to Brittany or to Provence, but France recognizes individual rights of citizens. So how is this played out in the Caucasus? I would say that in the Caucasus, throughout history, the different empires and states that ruled this area did not particularly recognize individual rights, but they did recognize collective rights. If we look at the Qajar Empire or the Safavid Empire or the Ottoman Empire, so those empires were not very strong in recognizing individuals, but they did recognize collective rights. So Armenians as a religious millet had certain rights in those Muslim empires. I would say that the Russian and even the Soviet systems also recognized collective rights, and they were not very strong in recognizing individual rights. For example, the Soviet Union recognized that in mountainous Karabakh, there was an ethnic Armenian specificity, and that's why those, this community was given a collective right, although a very low degree of autonomy. Now, I would argue that Azerbaijan, until the war, followed this idea of collective rights. Azerbaijan recognized that it was ready to give I'm quoting, the highest form of cultural autonomy, unquote, to Karabakh Armenians. Now, in the post-war period, Azerbaijan is not recognizing any collective right to Karabakh Armenians. And Azerbaijan is putting forward that Karabakh Armenians can have individual rights. But the Azerbaijani political system and Azerbaijani behavior in Hadrut and Shushi is showing that Azerbaijan is not recognizing any collective or individual rights neither. So in conclusion, I would like to say that I think Armenian-Azerbaijani conflict is just like French-German conflict or Arab-Israeli conflict. this is a conflict that evolved in history and has very concrete problems. And we need to recognize those problems, which are of historical, ideologic, and legal nature, and we need to give concrete solutions to this. I think that in the current political system of Azerbaijan, Karabakh Armenians cannot find a place. And I can only imagine that a third party is necessary to guarantee the collective rights of Karabakh Armenians as the only way not to put their physical security into question. I think I exhausted my time. I thank you very much for your patience and for your attention. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Cheterian. I would like to now welcome Mr. Ruben Carranza via Zoom.
Thank you very much for having me. I was hoping to have been in Yerevan today. Unfortunately, my travel schedules became problematic and I had to opt for being with you by Zoom. This would have been my 5th visit to Yerevan. I first went to Armenia in 2018, right after the revolution, and which then allows me to start by presenting some slides that I hope can help in this discussion. I work for the ICTJ, the International Center for Transitional Justice, and the topic in this panel sort of is a mashup of displacement, transitional justice, and apologies, and so I'd like to tackle the transitional justice part if I can. Revolutions and transitions go together, and transitional justice has often played a role in making sure that a revolution and a transition creates opportunities for accountability. And of course, many of you are familiar with this transition in 1965. The United Nations has a definition of transitional justice, and I'll read it quickly. The UN Secretary General says transitional justice is the full range of processes and mechanisms associated with a society's attempts to come to terms with a legacy of large-scale past abuses. Transitional justice can include both judicial and non-judicial mechanisms, such as individual prosecutions, reparations, truth-seeking, institutional reform, vetting, and dismissals, or combinations of those mechanisms. When I first went to Armenia in 2018, it was to discuss the possibility of transitional justice right after the revolution. And in the slide, you can see that we had a meeting with the Prime Minister. And what was, I think, important in this meeting is the acknowledgement by the Prime Minister that Armenia has a lot to learn from comparative examples, from countries that have gone through transitions, from countries that have emerged from authoritarian rule, and countries that have emerged from a combination of authoritarian rule and corruption. One of the more important points that ICTJ, on the other hand, talked about in that meeting and in the subsequent meetings we had is the importance of consultations, the importance of participation, the importance of having stakeholders participate in how transitional justice has to be defined. And this is a photo I took of a young Armenian when I was in Yerevan. I think this was the 3rd time I was in Yerevan. This was right after there was an attempt to dissolve Parliament, and your Prime Minister had to go to Parliament go on Facebook Live as well and convince Armenians to come out into the streets and support his then fledgling government. Among the various questions that we have raised in our work in Armenia is what transitional justice in Armenia should cover. And one question that we've often asked and are still discussing with different stakeholders in Armenia is whether transitional justice in Armenia should deal with corruption. The Prime Minister and many other political leaders in Armenia have explicitly said that corruption should be dealt with in transitional justice measures in Armenia, including, among others, prosecuting former corrupt leaders, investigating and seeking the return of their ill-gotten assets, as well as institutional reforms that deal with institutions that ought to have addressed corruption. Another area that we've been discussing with Armenian stakeholders is institutional reform. Some of you will remember that there were efforts to reform courts and prosecutions institutions in Armenia, and these demands for reforms included mobilization. Armenian citizens actually literally going outside courts demanding resignations, demanding changes, demanding the vetting of courts and judicial officers. Another area that we've discussed with Armenians in talking about transitional justice is the environment, as well as social and economic rights. This is a photo of a protest outside a mining area in Armenia, and this has become one of the more important questions that have faced the Pashinyan government. Now, this conference is about the war in Nagorno-Karabakh, in Artsakh, if some Armenians would call it. And I think it's important at the outset to say that ICTJ's work has not principally focused on the war. When we came in 2018, the situation was what it was then, and in 2020, the conflict had resumed. But it's important for us as ICTJ to mention that regardless of the asymmetrical context, Armenia's political situation is very different from Azerbaijan's political situation. Accountability for war crimes and crimes against humanity in the conflict must include both sides, must cut across all sides even. Meaning, it must not only focus on accountability for war crimes and crimes against humanity committed against Armenians, but must also include war crimes and crimes against humanity committed against citizens of Azerbaijan. It must not only include war crimes and crimes against humanity committed by Azeri forces, but also those committed by Armenian forces, including those forces that are in Nagorno-Karabakh. That's why I included in this slide a report by Human Rights Watch on humanitarian law violations during the armed conflict, documenting both violations committed by Azerbaijan's armed forces as well as by Armenia's armed forces. And I think it's important for Armenian human rights activists, whether in Armenia or in the Armenian diaspora, to not forget that war crimes and crimes against humanity do not distinguish among citizens, do not distinguish among different identity groups, do not distinguish between Azerbaijanis or Armenians. I think it's important for human rights activists worldwide to remember that accountability is important regardless of your nationality, regardless of your ethnic origin, regardless of how you see your identity. So revolutions and transitions are opportunities for transitional justice. They allow stakeholders, particularly young people, to participate in designing transformation, in designing accountability. And ICTJ has done a lot of work with activists. And in one of these meetings, let me quote what we were told by young people we met in 2019. One of them said that we, meaning young activists in Armenia, we were in the 2018 revolution because we saw corruption and unequal distribution of wealth, and a year later, the new government hasn't delivered. So young people have a lot to say about accountability, and it's important to remember their role, not just in talking about transitional justice within Armenia, internally, with respect to its government, but even with respect to the war in Nagorno-Karabakh. I'll mention a couple of examples in other countries in which young people have led transformations as a result of transitions. In Chile, youth-led protests against austerity, against economic policies led to the drafting of a new constitution. And most recently in Chile, that constitution, the old constitution drafted by Augusto Pinochet's dictatorship, is now being revisited and revised. And then an election took place in which the youngest president of Chile, a democratic socialist, has been elected. In Tunisia, where ICTJ also works, young people have led transitional justice processes, including in the establishment of a Truth and Dignity Commission that has heard testimony about corruption in Armenia, in Tunisia, about human rights abuses by the dictatorship in Tunisia. So revolutions can be continuing revolutions. Even after a revolution takes place, a government is changed, there can be transitional justice processes that continue the demands of that revolution. In the United States, Black Lives Matter protests, and many of the Armenian diaspora will be familiar with this because this has spread across the United States, not just where I am in New York and New Jersey, but in California. I'm sure Armenians in Glendale would have even participated in some of these youth-led protests. In France, you've seen the recent election and the promise that another world is possible. So it's important to look at the role of young people in dealing with transitional justice and the possibility of accountability and even peace involving the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict. Now, I mentioned earlier the asymmetrical context between Azerbaijan and Armenia, and I think it's important to acknowledge that there is a very significant difference, of course, in how the two countries have responded to accountability demands and to the prospects for peace involving the war. In Armenia, the transition was from corrupt one-party rule to a more democratic system of government. But in Azerbaijan, there has been no transition from what is essentially an inherited dictatorship. This means that in Armenia, you have more democratic space and therefore more opportunities for accountability. At the same time, fascist, many right-wing groups in Armenia and even outside Armenia will use this democratic space to promote authoritarian agendas that are disguised as populism and sometimes even disguised as nationalism. So one question to ask is, how does war and military tension with Armenia's neighbors expand or restrict this democratic space that has come out of the 2018 revolution? Another question to ask is how the absence of democratic space, on the other hand, in Azerbaijan, impacts on demands for accountability and support for peace among Armenians. I mentioned this slide because this is one point that has been raised, that it might be important for Azerbaijan and people in Azerbaijan to have their own transition, to have their own revolution. And this is who has, among others, said that piece. Now, that, of course, is for Azerbaijani people to decide. And as of now, that's not a prospect that is near. At the same time, young Armenians can translate demands for accountability and peace. This is how the revolution, in a way, emerged, not just in 2018, but even before that, through demands for economic and social rights, through demands for addressing very basic needs of Armenians. Electric Yerevan as a predecessor of the revolution. So one question to ask is, what do young Armenians think about fighting what is becoming an endless war? Do they want to fight in that war? Do they want peace? And what terms of peace do young Armenians want? I think it's important to always take into account what they have to say, as well as what young Azerbaijanis have to say. This is a picture of a Azerbaijani soldier who committed suicide, and he would have turned 22 last year. This is important because ICTJ also works with mothers in black, the mothers of young Armenians who have died in suspicious circumstances in the front line in Nagorno-Karabakh. Some of them have allegedly died through suicide, and I think there are demands for investigating those claims by the Armenian state. Displacement and transitional justice. Displacement is an issue that is being addressed by transitional justice in other countries. And I take this quote from Thomas de Waal in a recent article in which he says that the pendulum has swung decidedly in Azerbaijan's favor in this 30-year conflict. In 1994, the Armenians won a military victory in the first war with Azerbaijan, following which they not only held Karabakh, but occupied partially or wholly the 7 Azerbaijani districts around the enclave, having forced out more than 500,000 people who live there. But in 2020, Thomas de Waal continues, the Azerbaijanis recaptured these 7 regions and seized around a third of the territory of Nagorno-Karabakh, driving out at least 20,000 Armenians. It is now the Armenians of Karabakh who feel threatened, concerned that if it were not for the Russian peacekeeping force, they would be forced to quit their homes altogether. I borrow this quote to point out that both sides, Azerbaijan and Armenia, have experienced displacement, have experienced the suffering that conflict brings. And so one of the more important responses to displaced populations is to meet their common needs, whether they are from Azerbaijan or whether they're from Armenia. And this graphic illustrates what those needs are. The need for basic services and security is at the bottom, and it starts there. The need for community and family support, the need for more focused mental health care, and the need for specialized services. And we can discuss this in the questions and answers. So a couple of last few slides. What can advocates for human rights and accountability in Armenia and Azerbaijan do, including the Armenian diaspora? The most important for me is to do no harm. It's important to treat victims of war crimes and crimes against humanity equally, regardless of their citizenship or ethnic identity. A second point I will stress is the importance of not reducing human rights and international humanitarian law into apolitical legal standards, as if they were simply technical norms that one side or the other has to follow. There's a history of conflict. There are legacies of injustice and inequality that comes into play when we talk about human rights and international humanitarian law. A third point, do not privilege political and social rights over economic, social, and cultural rights, especially in times of conflict. A fourth point, do not let national identity erase the common social and economic interests of global South countries, including both Azerbaijan and Armenia. And the fifth point, do pursue transitional justice that addresses legacies of inequality and elite-driven division, again, whether in Armenia or in Azerbaijan. Just to emphasize do no harm, the fact that Azerbaijan tried to stoke ethnic hatred among its own people obviously does harm and imperils the prospects for peace. And of course, many of you are familiar with the Trophies of War Museum that Azerbaijan's government installed in its capital. But at the same time, I think the question ought to be asked, are there steps that Armenians, whether in Armenia or in the diaspora, have taken that might also be doing harm, that might also be imperiling the possibility of peace, or at least the possibility of coexistence. The last two slides. What transitional justice processes can Armenia and Azerbaijan learn from? And some of these are contexts in which ICTJ has done work. In Indonesia, which occupied the country of Timor-Leste or East Timor for 25 years, at the end of that occupation, they created a joint commission on truth and friendship. There's a lot to be said about whether it was effective and whether it was meaningful, but it's an example of two countries formerly at war, one occupying the other, that established a joint truth commission. In Cyprus, again, an example of a country that is divided, at least in the part of that country occupied by a foreign state. There's a joint committee on missing persons that deals exclusively with those who went missing during the conflict in northern Cyprus. In Palestine and Israel, the United Nations created a registry of damage caused by the construction by Israel of a wall in occupied Palestinian territory. This pertains to reparations, but it's an example of how the United Nations can play a role in at least documenting and recognizing damage caused to civilians by occupation and by conflict. And of course, the Turkish-Armenian Reconciliation Commission, created by civil society from Turkey, from Armenia. This is the same Turkish-Armenian Reconciliation Commission that commissioned ICTJ to come up with a memorandum, a legal memorandum, asking the question whether the UN Convention on Genocide would have applied to events occurring in the early 20th century in the Armenian part of the Ottoman Empire. And the conclusion by ICTJ's legal counsel, we engaged legal counsel to answer that Turkish-Armenian Reconciliation Commission question, was that the killing of Ottoman Armenians can be said to include all of the elements of the crime of genocide as defined in the convention. And historians, politicians, journalists, and other people would be justified in continuing to describe it as genocide. I mention this because it shows that there is a possibility of jointly answering questions involving a conflict between two countries, in this case, Turkey and Armenia, and that it can be led by civil society groups. So let me end with a photo I took in one of my visits to Armenia. Transitional justice is a way that guarantees a future, and it's important to have young Armenians, those directly affected by conflict, including by the taking of their own lives, that they be participants in discussing how peace can be made possible in your country. So thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Mr. Carranza, and all our speakers. So we did get some questions. We'll go ahead and we'll try our best to get to most of them. In the meantime, if you're responding to questions, please go a little slow so that our translation team will be able to accurately translate the questions. Thank you. So the first question is to Mr. Ghazaryan. You mentioned that the Armenian government has not clarified the legal status of refugees from Artsakh. While unclear, could you please elaborate what they are? And relatedly, how does Azerbaijani government classify these displaced individuals?
Thank you. So is this working? So there's only one legal document which speaks to the status of people from Nagorno-Karabakh, and I can speak about it openly because the document has been mentioned in one of ECHR cases, the decision of which has been delivered by the court in 2017, which is Chirago versus Armenia. I assume most of you are familiar with it. The case
so the deliberations of the court, they quote a document signed by the interior ministries of Armenia and Karabakh on February 24th, 1999, about the legal status, which says that the Republic of Armenia provides inhabitants of Nagorno-Karabakh Republic with passports, with identity documents, which do not speak to their citizenship, which do not provide them with citizenship. So this is something like a laissez-passer document if you look at other parts of the world. But this is totally inconsistent with the Armenian legislation, because the law on the passport of the citizen of the Republic of Armenia says that the document, the passport, is an acknowledgement of citizenship. Right. So here at least we have two documents that are in conflict with each other, but legally speaking, the document that was signed between two agencies is not part of our legal system, because if it was an international document, it would have to be ratified by the parliament. It never was. And our law on passport says that passport is about citizenship. So in one sense, if we strictly follow the law, then we might say that this is about the citizenship, the Armenian citizenship of those people. But it is not. We distinguish those people with their registration. So one thing I just want to draw your attention upon is how this one step has brought a conflict, an international conflict, I would say, well, internationalized conflict, into the lives of ordinary people. It just directly entered the lives of ordinary people. Their possibility to exercise their right to free movement, and it's a question whether they do have that right, right? Because the right of free movement is not an absolute right. It is usually provided by the constitutions of given countries. So for the citizens of Armenia, it is provided by the Republic of Armenia. So this, in a very Orwellian manner, I would call a double thing. We have created a double thing. We have created a double reality, which is, to my mind, it's not contributing to the solution of the conflict or to easing the everyday burden that those people face in their lives. So again, if we come to the clarity, those people are citizens of the Republic of Artsakh, for whatever it means.
Thank you. So the next question is for Mr. Carranza. You mentioned transitional justice looking backwards at issues like corruption and making reparations punishment, and there are obvious reasons why that may be advantageous. But in other contexts, such as Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa and Canada, they committed to only talking about the past, but not punishing, in order to facilitate more honest discussion and admissions. What approach do you see as better for the Armenian context?
I heard that it was addressed to me, but I also only got part of that question, and mostly, especially the last part. Can you read it again?
Yes, of course. Let me try a different mic. Is this one better? Can you hear me? Okay. Okay. What about now? Okay, let me read the last part of the question. But in other contexts, such as Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa and Canada, they committed to only talking about the past, but not punishing, in order to facilitate more honest discussion and admissions. What approach do you see as better for the Armenian context? Do you want me to repeat the question?
I, I think that was still something I couldn't understand, but let me just try to hazard an answer to a question that I only half heard. The examples that are, of course, very prominent for most people are South Africa, and I'm glad that Canada was mentioned. And different contexts will always have different ways of carrying out transitional justice. In Armenia, the reason our work has focused on corruption and human rights violations is because those are the grievances that drove the revolution that happened in 2018. We have done work in countries that are emerging from conflict, or even in countries that are still in conflict. We're doing work in Syria, we're doing work in Libya, for example, and we're doing work in Lebanon. And I mention these countries because the conflicts that are going on in these countries are low intensity in some cases, very intense in some periods, but in all of these countries, you have conflicts that appear to be almost irresolvable. But we are also doing work, and I mentioned this earlier, in countries where division has taken place, where occupation has happened, where historical injustices and legacies are continuing to impact on the present. So these contexts will vary, but there are often lessons to be learned. And one of the lessons is the importance of doing no harm, not to aggravate that conflict, not to make it even more difficult to resolve, and at the same time to focus on the needs of the civilian victims of the conflict. And focusing on the needs of that conflict might also mean prioritizing those needs over the possibility of prosecutions, over the possibility of prosecuting individual war criminals, individual violators of crimes against humanity. I am not saying that we totally dispense with holding individuals accountable, or that we do not document war crimes or crimes against humanity. But I am also saying that in many of the countries we work in, where there is conflict that is ongoing or conflict that has just ended, it is very important to prioritize the needs of everyone affected by that conflict, because those are needs that cannot be postponed, and meeting them becomes very urgent. So let me just stop there. And I'm sorry if I didn't answer the question. I did not really hear it completely.
Thank you. The next question is for Dr. Vicken Cheterian. The state of Azerbaijan has prevented fact-finding organizations such as the U.S. Blue Shield to go in and investigate any crimes. Is there a way we can overcome this? And if so, how?
In fact, the government of Azerbaijan blocked a number of missions that were planned, including humanitarian mission. There was supposed to be a UN interagency mission to the war zone, to Karabakh and to the areas affected by war in December 2020. There was supposed to be a UNESCO component in this mission to work on cultural heritage, to protect very sensitive medieval churches, monasteries, khachkars, and so on. And now it's been nearly 2 years, a year and a half, and Azerbaijani authorities have not permitted this mission from taking place. And we are talking about the UN. I think this issue should be raised. I think there should be international pressure on Azerbaijan. As I said, I see the only guarantee for the safety and security of Karabakh Armenians is by the presence of third-party guarantees, and I think international organizations including the UN, is very important. I should mention that in the November 9 agreement, one of the UN agencies was named, UNHCR, and even that, up to today, is blocked from going and doing its work in Karabakh and the regions around it. So only international pressure and insistence can change this fact.
Right. Thank you. So the next question is not addressed to anyone specifically, but feel free to respond. Wouldn't Aliyev lose credit when he makes so-called historical claims to true Armenian lands, especially his comments post-war claiming Yerevan? What are some ways Armenia or Artsakh can use this to their advantage? For sure, go for it.
Thank you so much. But this doesn't directly answer that question, though I heard it completely. But this line of argumentation that goes around here, and I can sort of feel it, I think it's a wrong one. The thing is that usually where we think, and usually where our scholarship has concentrated for more than 30 years, is we turned our scholarship into a tool to create arguments to contradict Azerbaijan. And I think this is not correct. Maybe we should think in another manner. Maybe we should think what the reality is and how do we want to deal with the reality. And basically that is the essence of self-determination, right? The phrase speaks for itself. You yourself determine what the reality is, and then you try to develop tools how to work with that reality. Otherwise, we are constantly in the reaction, you know, he said this, you said this, the other person said the third thing. So how do we deal with it? And it turns out the scholarship is turned into parroting, I'm sorry. And so I think we should give up that line and just look really at the hard facts, however bitter, however unpleasant they might be for us, and then try to understand how to work with it. Maybe in the process of that, we might develop the real arguments, either to contradict or to agree or to negotiate with any other party. And there, I'm not naming any parties, right? Any other party. Just, we turned our scholarship into this, tool of creating contradictory arguments, and that has ruined our scholarship. Sorry for the harsh words.
Thank you. The next question. What were some of the added challenges for the international community with forced displacement during the worldwide COVID pandemic in 2020, and how did the community react? This is not addressed to anyone specifically, so please feel free to take a stab at it. Mr. Carranza, Dr. Cheterian.
Sorry, I didn't hear that at all.
I'll go ahead and repeat the question. What were some of the added challenges for the international community with forced displacement during the worldwide COVID pandemic in 2020, and how did the international community react?
I'm sorry, it's just not possible to hear anything.
Okay, so I'll go ahead and send it to Maria. Right. Okay, you'll get the question via a chat. All right. I believe we have, before we get to that question, we do have a question for Mr. Ghazaryan. You mentioned fragile states being the ones being displaced. What makes a state fragile? Is it their economy, low number of citizens, lack of military?
Well, that's actually not directly part of my expertise, but I'll try to cover that in a few words. All of the arguments that you have mentioned there, but you know, what are the basic characteristics of a state, right? So we have Montevideo Convention about what the state is, right? And there are three basic characteristics. First of all, it's territory. Second, it's the population, and third is sovereignty, right? So if any of those characteristics are absent, the state is fragile. You know, so most that creates fragility is the argument of sovereignty, which means that there is, maybe in Weberian terms, that there is no one single source of legitimate violence in a given territory. So there should be, if we follow Max Weber, so the understanding is that on a given territory there is just one source of legitimate violence, right? So only one entity can produce legitimate violence in one territory. So the absence of that one single entity, which has the consent of the population to be able to produce violence if needed on a given territory, that, to my mind, creates most of the fragility. And if we look at the conflicts now around the world that produce most of the displacement, usually that is the main characteristic that has produced that displacement. I don't know how much I covered it.
Thank you. Mr. Carranza, are we ready to go back to the previous question?
Hi. So thank you. I just saw the question in writing. So let me answer it in two ways. Even without a pandemic, it still is very difficult to meet the demands of the displaced. There is a set of principles called the Pinero Principles, named after the former UN ambassador diplomat Sergio Pinero, which specify some of the human rights and humanitarian law obligations owed by the international community to the displaced. And this would apply to both Azerbaijan and Armenian citizens in Nagorno-Karabakh, as well as in the other areas in both countries affected by conflict or displacement, and including not just displacement from 2020, but displacement over the years, over decades. I think it's important to not forget that displacement isn't just what happened in 2020, but what happened in 1996 or even earlier. And I think that's important to remember. But with the pandemic, access to healthcare is obviously one difficult problem. Access to basic services in general was exacerbated by the pandemic. There are mechanisms in which humanitarian assistance becomes possible even during the worst conflicts. And I'm glad that Vicken mentioned the possibility, for instance, of humanitarian agencies going into the area. That has been done in Syria, for example. That is being done in Libya as well. But more than that, I think it's important for state authorities in both Azerbaijan and Armenia to consider the possibility of trust-building measures through humanitarian action by both countries for both groups of people in these areas who are displaced. I think that should not be a problem because it does not resolve any territorial questions. It does not address identity questions. It simply responds to the immediate needs of everyone who has been displaced by conflict.
All right, thank you. I believe this will be the last question, and anyone can actually respond to this one. Currently, Armenians are very much concerned about state building, strong institutions, justice, security areas, social well-being. In this case, how truth-informed reforms and accountability contribute to that, and what Armenians and the diaspora can undertake to go through hardship of truth-seeking about Armenian past and building strong and accountable state.
Thank you for that question. State building is a long-term aspiration, and Armenia, even if it has a long history, its history of being a state has been, of course, interrupted by different state formations, from the Ottoman Empire to the Soviet Union to the short-lived republics, and now, of course, Armenia in 2018. Transitional justice is only part of what might help in building a strong and accountable state. And I think the diaspora plays a very important role in that. Let me give two examples that are brief. In Colombia, the Colombian diaspora, we've worked with some of the Colombian diaspora communities in Boston, for example, have been very, very helpful in the ongoing Truth Commission process in Colombia that deals with internal conflict there. Not only have they responded by getting in touch with exiles, those who fled Colombia, displaced and then became refugees, fled to Boston and the United States, and helping them understand the Truth Commission process going on, the larger transitional justice process going on in that country. Elsewhere in Israel, Palestine, ICTJ has worked with the Palestinian Authority in dealing with how an authority in a region that is occupied by a foreign power can continue to address transitional justice issues. I mentioned the UN registry that has recorded damage suffered by civilians by the wall built by Israel in Palestinian territory in the West Bank. And we've worked with the Palestinian Authority in ensuring that the forms used to register claims for damages, access to these forms, being able to quantify harm suffered over the years because of the wall, is addressed. So the diaspora can certainly help in some of these very basic tasks that are more difficult to do in the area where it is happening, in Nagorno-Karabakh where it is happening, among the displaced communities of both Armenians and Azerbaijani people where it is happening. So they do not necessarily lead to a strong state or an accountable state, but I think having citizens understand their rights in the middle of conflict helps build a strong and accountable state.
Thank you. And Dr. Cheterian or Dr. Ghazaryan, if you wanted to respond to the same question. Dr. Cheterian, did you want to respond to this question? Okay.
So that question is again not a professional one for me. That's a more philosophical, I would say, question. But in terms of state building, if a couple of books I have read inform me of something, is that we have the need of two things: strong institutions and knowledge. What are the strong institutions? Strong institutions is a repetitive behavior that produce patterns. So this is our need, and secondly is knowledge. What diaspora? Well, that is something we have to build here, and I think we are on the path of it. What diaspora can bring in this case? Diaspora can bring connections, obviously, with its large network all over the world. Can bring expertise, something that in one area of or another we might not have in here. Secondly, it might, well, thirdly already, it might not bring disappointment, in a sense that if their ideas are not realized or are not realized in a manner that they would imagine in the Republic of Armenia, diaspora should not be disappointed because this is not the reality that they dwell in, right? They dwell in a different reality, and when you come and change the context, your ideas might get realized in a very different manner. So this evasion of disappointment is pretty important. And finally, if someone wants to be repatriated, that should be encouraged. So adding up to numbers, repatriation might be a good idea. So, thank you.
Thank you. And Dr. Cheterian, it seems like you wanted to also answer this question. So, can you hear us, Dr. Cheterian? Are we experiencing any technical issues? Okay, and then I said last question, but I lied. There is a question for Ruben Carranza. You mentioned that you've been in Armenia numerous times. Have you been in Azerbaijan?
I cannot hear you.
Was it Dr.? Okay, so I guess the response is that he hasn't. All right, I think that concludes our panel. Thank you very much to all of you for being here, and of course to our speakers. There is going to be a 30-minute break from 2:30 to 3 o'clock. It's a coffee break. Please go and enjoy some coffee, and we'll resume at 3 o'clock downstairs in the Manukian Hall. Thank you very much.